So she's okay. So,
Good.
that's great. That's so great. It's whatever you gotta get to strong this year. Congratulations.
Alrighty, we can get this started. It's 4 o'clock. So, hi everyone, my name's Cheyenne. It's good to see some folks in person that I've only met online. And I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today, Tristin McHugh. Tristin started her career at UC Santa Cruz with a major in marine biology and a minor in legal studies, as well as earning a scientific diving certification. She then moved on to San Diego State University to pursue her master's studying subtitle algal community assemblages with Dr. Matt Edwards. Tristin then held a role as the North Coast Regional Manager for Reef Check, which is actually where I first met Tristin as a scientific diver in training. And she has spent countless hours underwater in kelp forests and is now using that experience with her position with the Nature Conservancy as the Kelp Project Director, where she works in kelp forest conservation and restoration. I'll now pass it over to Tristin to talk to us today about Act Local, Think Global.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Hi everyone. Can you hear me okay in the back? Great. First off, thank you so much for having me. I live in Mendocino, so I took a flight here today, my first flight in a couple years, and I'm really excited. Like I feel like it's been kind of a missing link for a lot of work I've been doing, is to not necessarily like connect with folks and have this meaningful in-person contact. So thank you so much for hosting this and putting it all together. I know it takes a lot of work to do stuff like this. So today I am going to talk about kelp forest restoration more generally, but really I'm going to show you some local examples with a global perspective. And today I'm also going to be sharing out works from collaborators, so it's not just me at all in this silo or TNC. Like, we work with a number of different folks in academia, the government, other nonprofits that contribute to this body of work. So I'm just sharing out our collective successes and failures. So, classic. All right, we're going on to
Just click the presentation.
like presentation. Ah, thank you. Oh, you're amazing. Thank you. Okay, so overview, we'll talk about kelp loss. We'll then go into restoration techniques. I'll show a couple projects that were testing some of these restoration science questions in Mendocino, and then leave you with some resources, things that you can use for your research or share with others studying this ecosystem. So a little background, Cheyenne mentioned, I started diving in 2011 as a student at Santa Cruz. And over the next few years, from 2011 to 2013, 14, I was just like in the water all the time. It was like that peak field life that I know we all understand, just hitting it hard. And around that time, and 3 years later in 2014, that's when these changes started happening. These changes that we now know to be quite catastrophic, but at the time, we just started noticing these little changes in the ecosystem. And so my research changed. I was working for a lab that did mostly ecosystem monitoring, and our work fundamentally changed, where one day I was just doing these long-term monitoring projects, and next we were actively looking for any remaining sunflower star with disease. So the scope of my work changed, and I think, again, at the time, we didn't know how big this was. We were just capturing in the moment, thinking this was an ephemeral issue that our system was facing. In 2016-17, I had the wonderful opportunity to go to the Aleutian Islands, where for the first time, I saw an urchin barren with a species that I had never seen before in California. And this, like, for me, it was just kind of my own personal awakening moment to see another place undergo this change that we know to exist in California and other places. And for decades, this system is known to switch from a kelp forest to an urchin-barren state. So I think the longevity of the Aleutian Islands conundrum of kelp loss really also got me thinking about not only states as they are, but how they can flip, what makes them flip, how often do they flip, those sorts of questions. And so this also drew in this global perspective. This issue is not unique to California. And so after I finished grad school, I moved to Mendocino to start work as a diver. I was diving the North Coast extensively during this time. And I got underwater and I saw this system that, you know, again, we didn't necessarily know urchin barrens were formed like this in that space, or I didn't at least. And what we knew was this lush forest, home to many species of fish, invertebrates. There was a recreational abalone fishery, which was the last for the state. And then again, the story, 2014, you had this warm water, you had the loss of sea stars to this marine disease event. It was a disease that air quoting, like we still don't know a lot about it. And so we lost a predator, and then we started to see urchin changing behavior. They were moving out from these cracks and crevices when they're usually passive feeders. They started looking for food actively. And so aerially, right, like we were doing these drone surveys and a bunch of folks were understanding kelp dynamics over time. We started seeing losses. Same with the subtidal environment, and outside of academia, the public noticed before many to say, like, I'm seeing my home disappear. This place I've known forever is not here anymore. And so by the late 2010s, there was insurmountable evidence really that this issue wasn't necessarily going to fix itself maybe in our lifetime. I think that scale of time was like a question mark. Like it would potentially flip, whether or not we'd be there to see it was another question. And so I think that's what kind of leaned many folks into this question about doing some level of kelp forest restoration science to start. I'm sorry, this is a not great quality. I thought that looked better, but there's this amazing paper by Sylvie Dexter and Shibling from 2014 that really pinned down, I think in a really nice way. You can see these colors here. Pink are systems where they've seen a kelp to barren to kelp switch, and then dark purple kelp to barren, and then barren to kelp switch, and then you have straight barrens. And so this, to me, again, like painted a picture that, wow, like what I'm seeing is part of this network of catastrophic ecosystem loss. And many folks started thinking along those lines about this global issue, much as the way that we think about the loss of corals or mangroves or any other key foundational ecosystem. So what I'm going to share with you now is what we're doing in our small corner. Like, what are we doing locally in response to these changes? And ultimately, what we're interested in doing is testing tools that buy us some time, for one, right? But they also promote our learning of how to actually steward these systems in a changing environment and a changing ocean. So again, I'm going to just do a deep dive into a place and then we'll kind of bring it back out again. But for those unfamiliar, Mendocino is in Northern California, and it's actually 3 hours north of San Francisco and still 5 hours south of the Oregon border. It's like still that far away, but California is huge. And it is a linear coast, kind of like what you have here, super exposed, no marine lab, no dive shop, like virtually not a lot of resources to do this sort of work. And that influences the way that we restore that place. That local understanding of what is available changes our approach. So what we are starting in Mendocino is first by monitoring. We want to understand both aerial and subtidally, like where kelp is, how much there is, and the historical dynamics of those places. Like where are those persistent oases? Where are those places? So we do that in a number of different ways. The next bucket is resetting the ecosystem. What can we do to possibly wipe the slate clean or create a situation where Grazer suppression is mitigated to allow the ecosystem to breathe. And then similarly, reforesting is kind of that third step, which is basically cultivating kelp spores, making it so that kelp is basically like a garden that you're tending. How can you seed the environment in a way that makes sense for the place? So this is kind of the approach to restoration, and I'll start with this bucket and then we'll dig into these two. So from the monitoring, I just want to take a sec to talk about like aerial imagery, which is, for me as a diver, this is a totally new tool available to us. Like this wasn't necessarily, like the detail of it was not necessarily available a few years ago. So what this is researchers are in the process of exploring different types of aerial imagery with different capabilities. And by capabilities, I mean their resolution. So you have coastwide global scales, which is Landsat imagery. And that's typically on like the 100-meter resolution. So you pick up these big pixels, but not, you have like a tiny kelp patch, which is usually what we have. You can't really detect that. And then you have Planet Labs, which is also including that more regional scale. And that goes down to, I believe that's 3 meters or so. So you're getting closer. And then the final one that is like probably the most precise at this moment is drone imagery, which is this local scale, 3-centimeter resolution. So they can pick up like the tiniest kelp patches, which is incredibly valuable because that's all we have. And I think on that same vein, this technology is getting better and better with every year that passes. And just this year, it used to take months to process drone imagery from flight to sequencing to like create the maps. And this year they did it in like an hour. It was unlike anything we've ever experienced, which totally changed the way that we use this tool. And I'll talk about that at the end of the talk, but the field is rapidly evolving. And so with that in mind, so if you're kind of starting to understand like how kelp is dynamically, now the question is like, what kind of tools can we test at those places where we deem we want to start restoration? And so some of the tools we're looking at are recreational culling or crushing of urchin in situ. The next is commercial hand harvest of purple urchin. The third is urchin trapping and kelp enhancement. So those are kind of the 4 different, I would say, tools that we're really digging into. And in the North Coast, we have a few of them kind of layered on top of each other. And we want to create this almost mosaic of restoration efforts. So at one site, Alabama, hand harvesting and kelp enhancement. So those two working together. You remove urchin, you throw kelp in there. Like how do they work together? At Casper Cove, we have urchin trapping and recreational culling. So testing 2 different methods of urchin removal to see which, how they can be used independently or even in conjunction to increase your catch per unit effort. And then hand harvesting and urchin trapping. So with all those in mind, those are happening at those discrete locations. And then coastwide, we're also doing these C-STAR bioblitzes and that aerial imagery and subtidal imagery. So I know this is like a lot to look at, but this is kind of the way that we have to work in the restoration space because of the limited amount of time that you can actually get in the water in these places. So we're trying to leverage what we have. So recreational urchin culling, I think this one's very fascinating because the public really was, they were the ones kind of coming out saying like, something's going on, we want to do something. And at the time, do something meant like getting in the water and physically like crushing urchin or removing urchin. And so around spring of 2018, the bag limit went from, this was through your Department of Fish and Wildlife, which did Oregon follow similar with this? Do you know?
They're still in process.
They're still in process.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Department of Fish and Wildlife was like, okay, we'll do a bag limit increase. So it went from 35 individual urchin per day someone could have to then 20 gallons per day to then 40 gallons per day. So it was like this incremental like increase throughout the region. And it was great, like folks were getting out there, bringing loads of urchin, but it was also a little sketchy because folks were in this environment carrying these huge loads and they were having trouble. So folks really want to test out urchin crushing in situ as well. So the Department of Fish and Wildlife then at the end of 2019 opened up recreational urchin culling at one site to test like what the environmental impacts were of urchin crushing, and then also a social side to see if the public wanted to participate in that event in this space. So this is just some shots that I took at the event, like lots of folks showing up, and then this is like the aftermath, like a couple of weeks after, so you'd see shells everywhere. And I think it also introduces this interesting question around either leaving that carbon source in the water, right? Like crushing, you're kind of behaving as a marine organism almost, versus pulling where you're like, or sorry, harvesting where you're taking that carbon out of the ecosystem. So still undecided with how it's going to work, but I think there's going to be kind of a science side and then a social side of seeing how that work plays out. So again, like in the meantime, we're collecting social information also, so divers can fill out a volunteer form that we track to see how many folks are actually participating in this. Lots of dive clubs do it. We go on the beaches, we make sure folks fill it out, and that gives us an idea of participants. So between now and then, we're collecting subtitle information, aerial, and this, and when this regulation sunsets in 2024, we should have some understanding of how folks are actually utilizing this change. Okay, so commercial and harvest. So kind of switching out of like the public space into commercial. And when I say commercial, I mean like commercial red urchin divers who historically would go diving for red urchin. Those red urchin also moved into either deeper environments, shallower, died because of the kelp loss. And many commercial fishermen filed for federal disaster relief. And a big project that came out of this was, okay, you have a workforce that wants to go out and do something. Can they go out and reduce urchin densities enough to see kelp come? So in 2020, kind of like the public, right, kicked the ball down the court and then passed it off to the commercial divers. And this was a really big one because the state of California acknowledged the kelp loss as being an issue that they want to address. And this was an investment from the state of California to explore that question of urchin removal at a scale that was at like the acre-wide scale. So this work was done by a number of collaborators, and I won't get too deep into it, but we did just come out with a report that is posted on the Ocean Protection Council website. And it's also in our kelp restoration guidebook that I'll talk about at the end of this. But you can definitely read up on the details if you're interested in that in these two documents. Okay, grazer suppression. So the concept is you have an overabundance of grazers, in this case purple urchin. And the idea is to reduce those numbers to around less than 2 urchin per square meter. And the question mark is like, does kelp come at that point? Or is it like you reduce the urchin and then it's still a lag effect? That was the question. So what we did was we mapped an area. We put a benthic cable in that you can see here. That's the benthic cable. It's not too sophisticated. And then we monitored it, right? So we went across the site and we counted the urchin, the kelp, the rugosity. And then we sent divers in. We had them systematically go through the site from east to west, trying to like clear the site in a systematic way. They brought their catch back to shore, where then we weighed it and we dissected the urchin to look at urchin health. So we're looking at what they were eating, how healthy their gonads or reproductive parts were. We again weighed that catch. And this is what we saw. This is what we did. So in the first, I'd say 4 months, we basically just like hit it hard. Like fishermen, like there were 13 different guys participating at this point, all guys going in, removing 94 diver days. Then when the weather around now started getting bad, we stopped and we just kind of let the system coast, and we did fewer maintenance dives. And so what we really found was that pulse effort not only worked ecologically, but also socially. That's how the divers kind of wanted to work also. And we started to see kelp, which was really exciting. And this photo was taken 2 months after we started initial clearing. So we saw some level of response from the community that grazer suppression was working. And to dig into that a bit more, here we have like a before and after, and then on the y-axis, individuals per square meter. For purple urchin, you can see that our restoration in blue and our control site in yellow started around the same urchin density. Over 1 year, you can tell purple urchin actually increased at our control site and dropped drastically at our restoration site, which is amazing. Red urchin, quite a bit of variability by where you were, but generally same sort of trend where you saw an increase at the control and then a subtle increase at the restoration, which is fascinating because they were actually sublegal sized red urchin, the ones that the commercial divers could not harvest. So we had this almost like a recourse action happen where you had a different grazer, one that you couldn't necessarily remove for a number of reasons, move into the system, which is we can talk about later. And then bull kelp, right? Like what we want to see, right? And this was again like starting at the same at 0, and then towards 1 year later, you had some recovery. And I want you to notice the scale there too, right? Like limited recovery in 1 year. And I think that's an important note to make for grazer suppression. Just think about like a hillside with trees burning. Would you expect to see the trees a year later? Probably not. You may see some grasses. So I think that's like adjusting your expectations of what restoration scales actually work. So with that, again, these findings in 1 year of the study really showed like commercial divers can do it. And we do know it's expensive. We know they work really hard. We know it's very valuable, but finding other ways of being able to like put, I guess, like attract urchin when you're in that maintenance phase became kind of front of mind for a lot of us. Because a lot of folks didn't necessarily want to go and search a large area like optimal foraging theory style, right? So what other tools could we use? Which brought us to urchin trapping, which essentially is like not requiring a diver to physically get in the water for safety reasons. You know, sometimes there's bad visibility. So this is like an additional tool that could be used by folks also to potentially attract urchin. So the concept that we worked through this year, and how many of you are going to WSN by chance? A few. Okay, I'm giving a talk later this week on this stuff, so I'll keep it light, but the idea is we're testing these traps in kind of 2 different scenarios. One, in a site, that one I just showed you, Noyo, where commercial divers were removing urchin. We are throwing traps in there now to now say, how do traps work in a system where urchin are being actively managed? Like how well do the traps work then? Versus a site where it's pretty much like scorched earth urchin. No grazer suppression is happening at that moment. So what we ended up finding so far, sorry, I'm going to show you a little video. In the first year, what we found so far is the traps actually stay put. This is a piece of rebar that's like physically holding the trap like with a pretty solid amount of weight. And it's a flat trap type, 2 different types. Urchin moved to them. And we in the first year tried out fish and produce and kelp as drift kelp as bait. Urchin were not necessarily attracted to produce, and we tried like cabbage and broccoli and other local sustainably sourced delicious things that they didn't want. The fish actually attracted like marine mammals and some other creatures, which wasn't the most ideal. And then kelp, like nothing beats the good stuff. Like they just wanted that detritus, like more than anything. So you can, this was like literally minutes after the trap went in, like in under 10 minutes, basically. So it was really exciting. And this is generally what we found for this year. which is, again, you have that Noyo is that low urchin density site, Casper is the high. We didn't really find seasonal effects necessarily, but Noyo pretty much stayed at that low catch. Casper, obviously higher than Noyo, but in summer, we also, again, want to increase our CPUE. So we spatially distributed the kelp better on the traps and ended up catching way more urchin. So we adaptively kind of managed that tool in the moment and was like processing data in real time to make these little pivots. So I think we're slowly getting closer, and our fall data should be coming in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned. So that is urchin trapping. And kind of shifting gears out of the grazer suppression elements, we have kelp enhancement. So kelp enhancement is led by Moss Landing Marine Labs, and it's also in conjunction with the hand harvesting work, right? So same setup as the trapping we just walked through, but we have a site at Albion that targeted hand harvest of urchin is happening, and then a site where it is not. And we wanted to see, like, what is the success of those two outplantings in those two scenarios. And then when we're talking about outplanting, we're also talking about a few different types. So one is green gravel, where you have inoculated substrate. So taking it to the lab, having the spores settle on it, and then putting them out in the field. They also had sporophytes that they put on a little green gravel to put out in the field. So in total, we had green gravel, swirl bags, green gravel in bags, and then sporophytes. So a few different kelp enhancement strategies, all at a very small scale. So, you know, as long as this table, basically like little projects all along the way across the site. So the idea now at this point, and Moss Landing again is leading this body of work, they were trying to find like the most locally appropriate method for kelp enhancement. So for this year, for 2023, what we're really focusing in on are the logistically and fiscally sound kelp enhancement strategies, which, as far as we know right now from this study, is spore bags. So like bags, mesh bags that you physically put like the sorrel material, the reproductive parts of the kelp in to just get them to settle. And then the second one is inoculating lines. So that first picture I showed you, it's like basically getting, and this happened naturally actually, but you basically put this as you would green gravel in the lab setting, get the little individuals to attach, and then at some point take it in the field. So we're going to test those two methods hopefully next year. Okay. So then, you know, I think another like key piece of this, and Sarah could speak way better to this than I can, but sunflower stars, right? Like this was like the last predator in the system. And for Mendocino, similar to Oregon, it's really important. And it's really important because there's no predator redundancy. There are no otters, there are no sheephead, there are no lobsters, right? Like nothing else is keeping purple urchin populations in check, frankly. And in December, so a year ago, we hadn't seen a sunflower star in Mendo for like 2014. I haven't seen one since 2014. But it was spotted, like just some person like walking on the cliffs of Mendocino was like, I think they've arrived, and he knew who to contact. He contacted UC Santa Cruz and a few others, and like that news spread like wildfire. Like everyone was like, oh. But anyways, it was a really good sign, right? It was a sign that the ecosystem could potentially support that predator again, at least in that moment, right? So with that, we spun up this project with our local community science group, Noyo Center for Marine Science, and we picked basically like 7 different sites that during the king tides, we organized for volunteers to go and do these like BioBlitz events where they just go all over the coast, 7 locations, like low tide, and just look for sea stars. And the bummer was that we didn't find any sea stars, but the cool part was we actually know that because we looked. And I think that like 0 data point was also very helpful for us because because folks actually started looking for other sea star creatures too. Like there are other sea stars that play a very valuable role in the system. And it built this constituency of people that started gravitating around this concept of an apex predator as being something we like very much so need for health resilience. So this project, we're hoping to spin up even further with Cal Academy in the coming year, but I personally like love that project and it was really fun to do. Which kind of brings me to like kind of this wrap up of this. I just like downloaded a ton of information on you all about this work, but as you can tell, there's a lot of different moving pieces, and this wasn't even all of it. This was like a few of the many works that are touching down right now in California and beyond. And there's this emerging need generally to collaborate across all these different projects in space and in time. So again, I'll bring us back here, but really like layering these tools all together kind of give us a snapshot into like what is the most effective way to restore kelp forests financially, logistically, and then also culturally, like what do people want to do in this space? And we have to start by going out and collecting like the very baseline information to help lean into that. And I think one other piece I'll say is like this issue is not one size fits all, right? So like even if we are testing across these different locations, each one has its unique challenges. Some have a more persistent kelp patch than others. Other have been scorched earth for like almost 10 years now. So you have a sliding scale of what it will take to flip that system. Which brings me to this, right, is, you know, that Phil B. Dexter shibboleth paper kind of showed like, it's not like, I know I did this grand blanket explanation of like kelp loss, it's awful across this big region, it is, but there are also these like little microhabitats that may mean that like one of these sites are like the better spot to start restoration in than others. And so you have this like, you know, I went diving at these places this year and some of them stayed urchin barren, others started to get kelp again last year, but then urchin moved back. And then for some reason they didn't eat the coralline algae in that one, which is helpful to know because of settlement with coralline algae. Then you have other places like this where like there's no urchin, but there's also no kelp. So like what's going on there, right? So it's complicated. And I think that's part of the beauty of it too, that you can have this like very intensive local understanding that can kind of like lead you into this this global way of thinking about how systems respond over time. So I guess like one example of that, which I said get back to, is this is the drone imagery at that very small scale. So this is a paper that just came out by my colleague Vienna, who leads our mapping and monitoring work. But the concept is like, again, she was able to pump out this this map of one of our restoration sites in less than an hour. And what you're seeing is, sorry, it's not in chronological order, but in darker purple, you have 2020, blue is 2021, and green is this year. And one idea we had after Vienna flew these flights is we saw less kelp this year than we did last year, which actually like confounded the upward trajectory that we had seen in 2020 and 2021. Like it was on the upswing, and then 2022 just kind of didn't do what we wanted it to do. So we then wondered like, okay, where is like the most persistent, beautiful, lovely kelp patch? And we just like drew a point. And then I went diving with one of my colleagues and we like physically mapped out like what makes this persistent? Like, what's the substrate doing? What are the habitat associations with the kelps and everything else? So I think where we're starting to lean now is like bringing in all these tools we've been cultivating over the last few years and now apply it in a way that's meaningful to, again, getting like restoration success and using information to get us there faster and more sustainably. So that's kind of like the end of that. And then now I just want to focus like the last few minutes here on some restoration science resources that you might find useful for your work. Oh, sorry, that's all jittery too. But earlier this year, we came out with this kelp restoration guidebook that was basically developed by over 50 authors in 45 different institutions and was picked up by the United Nations Decade of Ocean Change. So it's really exciting. And what's cool about it is it walks you through, for the first time, like this hasn't really come together at this global level, an intro just like of what is happening, evaluating a need for kelp restoration, the human elements, like collaboration, communities, getting started, restoration action, like methods you could use, monitoring, evaluation, future proofing, conclusion, acknowledgements. But the reason I read through all of that is this was developed by people in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, like these chapters, because we're all working on a similar issue. And for some of us, they're more advanced than we are in California. Like there's some techniques being tested globally that like we are nowhere close to being able to have touchdown in California for like management reasons, or even just like where we're at with our knowledge yet. So it was really powerful to get to work with these folks who are like, oh, we did that a few years ago, try that, you know? So super exciting product. You can read all of this. And then one area I'm especially excited about is starting on page 53, which highlights these 11 different case studies from all over the world, which follow a similar setup where you basically get to learn like, why did those areas need to do restoration? What was the impetus to even like start in their areas? What was their problem inhibiting kelp to grow? What species are they working with? What communities? What kind of funding did they have? So pretty cool if you want to just like get a quick dive into different places experiencing this. And you can read more about that Northern California case study too. Okay, one other resource on the tail. So that guidebook is housed on the Kelp Forest Alliance webpage. And if you are a researcher, know someone who's doing some level of kelp research, you can, what is it called? Register. You can register your project on this website and also see who else is on that website. So it's basically this place where you can go to find out like the latest research, the latest place undergoing some level of restoration science. It's an awesome tool to just dig in and see what else is going on out there. And then one more is kelpwatch.org. So I mentioned Landsat imagery. This is a new tool that came out. And again, my colleague Vienna led the charge here with UCLA and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. But this is showing kelp forest dynamics at the 100-meter resolution scale over time. So what you're seeing is you can actually zoom in, pick a spot, find out that kelp area, look at percent cover relative to historical values, and then you can actually download that information. I don't know if you can see, but there's a CSV file you open, and it's all there for you. So it's like pretty incredible, and this is totally available for you to use and play around with. So the idea is that we're going to scale it further into other geographies, but it should cover right now from Mexico to, I believe, BC at least. So check it out if you haven't had a chance, kelpwatch.org. And then the last thing I'll say, so with everything going on, I can't also understate how important community involvement is. Not only for like communicating the science, but to be active participants. And a really, in my mind, like exceptional example is like, I met with a couple women who just really had this like creative marketing background and just like knew how to set up events and get people engaged and all of that. And I was like, sounds great. I don't have time, but they just like took it and ran with it and created this like excellent kelp gallery in San Francisco that just has folks walking in and seeing this exhibit. So this is just one example of like connecting with the public to actually get them engaged and support them, but not do the project for them. Like it was a very organic kind of, I think like organic formulation of this project. But again, like they have such vision for like how to communicate this stuff that sometimes it stays just like in my computer, you know? So working with local communities is great. And with that, I think that wraps up most of the like local global context. And again, like to thank all the folks that contributed to the work that I just showed you today. And that is it. Thank you for having me.
So when you clear these plots, how long does that stay that way?
Great
So you've been
question.
monitoring it for a couple years now.
Yeah.
Do they just immediately come back?
Wish. No, that's a great question. So at Noyo, at that site that we saw, basically after that 1 year, we took a pause and no clearings happened for 7 months. It was not necessarily by design, but we didn't remove urchin. And yes, urchin did move back into the site. So I can tell you 7 months. But one question, like I was just talking with Sarah about is, that may not be the case for every place. And you know how I showed like that sliding scale of like different ecotones, like you had an urchin barren and a kelpie, like urchin movement in it. That rate of incursion may be different across different different systems or different contexts. So extra starved urchin may be more likely to like move around, or maybe they're in torpor. I think that question is still up there. Cheyenne.
From on the sites that you showed, what do those sites look like topography wise? Like, are they all relatively similar, or do they vary in like rugosity? Or
Yeah, of the sites that I showed you, they're generally the same. They're all rocky reef, but very different. Like some are quite rugose, others are pretty flat, mixed substrates. Like they're pretty different, which makes it really hard to have like a Baki design where you want to have like, you know, some kind of control when it's really hard to find controls in restoration because of those like localized differences in general. So that's definitely like a struggle point for us. Yes.
There are a couple of questions on Zoom. The first one, it says, where were the spores used in restoration sourced from? Are there any concerns about population genetic structure?
Great question. So of all that kelp outplant, I'll answer that in 2 ways. So of all the kelp outplanting that we have done so far, they've all been sourced from that site. So there's some remnant population close by that we source from. But on the back end of that, there's work done inspired by the Nature Conservancy and Sea Grant with the Felipe lab Felipe's lab at University of Milwaukee, who found very low genetic divergence across populations across the range of bull kelp generally. That's still being kind of teased out right now, but at this moment, we understand there to be like pretty low differences across geography. Yes.
As someone who maintains a lot of nearshore moorings in Oregon, and I've never once thought like, oh, a baby bull kelp on my mooring might be beautiful and not just something to like. And so I guess I wonder if there's any plan or ideas about how other people who maintain moorings in nearshore can help monitor or, I don't know, use their lines to see bull kelp.
Love that. So yes to all the above. That's, I think, where we're heading for the kelp enhancement work next year, is thinking about basically like a in-water, I don't want to say farm, but like an in-water like aquaculture facility, which would include like figuring out a really slick mooring system, either with like vertically suspended, horizontally suspended, combination of the 2 lines to have kelp grow. But to your point, like, I love that. I love the idea of getting like really sturdy marine hardware and thinking about how to leverage that to like reach a new goal. I should talk. That sounds super cool. I love that. Yes.
Could kelp aquaculture be used as a tool for ecosystem and economic restoration?
Will kelp restoration be used for economic restoration as well?
Yep.
Yes. One area I didn't touch on today is our market-based solutions work. So on maybe like the back of all this work is a question of like, how do you get communities to participate in this event? How do you create jobs around it? Because you need people to go in and physically do this work. So Right now, we're exploring different uses for purple urchin at least, where we know if you go, like, if you get a huge bag of urchin cleared from the reef, like 20% of those are of urchin ranching size that you could potentially like clumping them up and, you know, put them into markets for food. But the other 80% are too small or damaged. So you have to use non-food uses. So we're in the process right now of trying to figure out like how to use them, also like the margins of how much it costs to do that.
There is another question that is says, following up on the question about how long it took them to come back, how are the urchins coming back? Is it recruitment of juvenile urchins, or are they physically walking back, or something different?
Ooh. Yeah, so that's a good question, because also the red urchin and purple urchin behave differently. And we know like in Monterey, they were working on these like patch reefs, just like a little island, like literally tiny like this, like little bigger islands. And red urchin would like tumbleweed across the sand and like land on that reef and then just like go to town. So you can kind of, you have that scenario. What I've seen, especially at I want to find it. I'm a visual person, sorry guys. One second. Too far. Oh no. Oh gosh, sorry. Now it's gotta be worth it. Okay, okay. It's kind of worth it. So basically when we were choosing a restoration site, we wanted to find a place that had like the lowest amount of incursion, but we didn't have like those patch reefs like Monterey to work with. So we settled for a situation where this was like the kelp that we wanted to protect. This was all sand. So like no urchin were here. This was all sand, no urchin were here. This is a cliff. So the only point of incursion was really on this western front right here. So what we saw in this particular situation was urchin like physically actually like coming in from here around and like moving down and across the site mostly. So I think it depends on how your site is set up, like how urchin move, but they walk. Like they have little tube feet and they just like start nudging towards, who knows, like oblivion. That's like a question mark. Cheyenne probably knows more than I do. I don't know. We don't know. Yes.
I had a question about the long-term planning and how do you manage doing these kinds of pulse perturbations again and again and again? Do you see like having to remove urchins for decades in order to get the kind of response from the kelp forest? Is it essential to have sunflower stars back in the system in order to make it sustainable long term?
Yes. The last point, yes. Until we get a hand, it's not just like having that predator there to just eat the urchin. It's also like a fear factor. It's like having someone or something there to like regulate the ecosystem. So yes, like until we have some level of apex predator in that system, I think we're just buying time to see like what humans can do in the way that we can do it. What was the first part of your question again?
Yeah, sort of along the lines of you had really cool results from that first pulse perturbation removal.
Yeah.
And is there a lot of social impetus to continue doing those? Or is it kind of like a burnout? Like we did that last year.
Yeah.
We have to go back and
Oh my gosh.
smash and remove or trap again.
That's a great thought, because I think we're in that moment right now where you know, with a project like this or some of the others, like you do lose attrition. Like folks are like, but we already did that. Whereas the result, like the impatience to see it through. But what we do know is kelp forests generally can rebound faster than terrestrial, like conifer forest or any kind of forest really. Because like kelp works on, like I didn't even mention, but bull kelp is an annual, right? So that it's really important that when we did restoration, again, like even seeing a single tiny bull kelp the year we started removing was like, yeah, but when you go to explain that, they're like, but where's the forest? And you're like, no, this is actually like, we have to start here. But to your point, like there has been a lot of, internally, I'm like, okay, what's next? But you really need to like wrap up project, which is why we did this like mosaic approach. Like I showed you, is a lot of these like intellectual and fiscal investments happened as one, and they were funded for 1 year. And then we're like, a lot of us were like, that's not gonna cut it. So we started adding more questions to keep those sites relevant and like keep building so that we could ultimately like see that 5-year maybe response. So
I wanna know what are your thoughts on those urchin traps? Like, yes, they're like more passive and you don't have to put in a diver in the water, but you still need a boat. And I imagine you need a lot of traps to like equal the efforts of one diver in one dive, because you can do a couple hundred urchins in one dive as a diver.
Yeah.
But just like the amount of time and effort spent between the two, is it like even are traps even worth it?
yeah, great question. TBD, like we're wrapping up our like fall field season to ask that very question, like what is the use case for those traps? Because I think the last thing we want is like one more thing in the ocean that's not really doing anything. But what we found, like anecdotally, we're working with a commercial fisherman, like he's the one actually deploying these traps, so he has that front of mind. And what he said is he's like, oh man, I can go dump these traps in, go jump in the water, go harvest a couple bags, come back, pull the traps, and you basically have like double bounty sort of thing.
Yeah.
So there might be that. Another use case could also be, after you do that first clearing, and then you have like, very low urchin density, big search, you could potentially use traps like magnets for urchin also to get them to come to one place so that you can clear them or like harvest them a little easier. But that's like a major question. It's like, how do they pair up next to divers? But sorry, one more note on that. Another impetus to doing that trapping work is in Mendocino, we have a lot of commercial fishermen who are retiring. So Grant, who we're working with, is the youngest commercial diver. And there aren't a lot of other folks entering that fishery. So it's also like being malleable to like who is available to get in the water still at all in the future. Yes.
Another question, it says, any wild plans of reintroducing otters? They used to be part of the system.
Yes, yes and no. That is like foundationally, otters inhabited that area. They should be there. Like they should be roaming those waters. When I go to answer that question, I think about it in two ways. It's like, if otters were to like start expanding their range back into Mendocino, like that's what's happening. I think the other question is like, do we physically go in and start translocating urchin? That's like, translocating otters. I think that's like a slightly different way of thinking about the problem. But at this moment, we know otters are not moving on their own. Like there's something kind of keeping them from expanding their range outside of like San Francisco Bay really, and moving northward, whether it's like not a lot of areas for them to like be safe. Like it's a really rough, sharky area. So I don't know if it would be in good practice to like send them into the pit before the pit's ready for them. If the pit's the kelp. Well, yes.
Do you have advice for our graduate students? You transitioned into a job with Nature Conservancy. Do you have kind of tips or advice for students who might be interested in that in the future?
Ooh.
Or how did you land your job?
I don't know. Great place, right? I don't know. I think I started with that story to kind of paint a picture of like taking opportunity of the relevant research in your field or in your moment. And so much of like what happened ecologically, I was talking to Cheyenne about this earlier, it's like so much of what happened ecologically like shaped how I do my work. And so I think it was just like, it felt very natural for me to like transition this way because it's been my reality for my entire like post-college career. That's just been it. So I don't know, to students, I think it's like finding, and also like being aware of like what needs to be done. So if a grad student is working on something that's remotely Kelp focused, I would suggest reaching out to like practitioners, government, nonprofit, like the people who are like on the ground doing that work, and just not necessarily sitting down and being like, what do you need me to do? But just explain your research to them and explain like what you're doing, and their response back will probably like help you shape the way you think about the application of your work. So I wish I did more of that in grad school to help like shift my mind from a more like question focus into an application of that question focus. Thanks, everyone.